So we will now let all the participants in the room. So good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining the launch of OECD's Framework for Industries Net Zero Transition. I will just give a few words to provide some practical information for today's events. So first of all, there is a translation into Bahasa and English that is available. So you can choose the interpretation option directly in Zoom. I will also ask all participants, except for the panelists, to keep the microphones and cameras off throughout the meeting, and to include the organization names besides the name and surname. That will also make it easier for everyone to identify who is who. The meeting will be recorded, so we'll also upload the video as well as summary notes in the coming weeks on our website, the website of CEFIM team. And the framework itself will be released today on OECD's website and OECD iLibrary. I give now the floor to Alain Besser, the acting director of OECD's Environment Directorate, will provide some opening remarks. Thank you.
Good morning and afternoon, everyone. This is my turn to welcome you. I welcome you all to this event, and I'm really glad to see so many participants. We all know the importance of manufacturing industry as a source of productivity growth, economic development, and material wealth. And with scores of services directly attached to manufacturing activities, it sustains economic activity and jobs well beyond the strict production of goods. But the carbon footprint of manufacturing industry is also very important. If one takes into account both direct and indirect emissions coming from electricity use, as well as emissions from industrial processing, manufacturing account for as much as 40% of global CO2 emissions, so quite significant. And as most of you would know, a few energy-intensive sectors are responsible for a large chunk of these emissions. So naturally, these industries will play a major role in the path to net zero. In fact, several policy fora at the regional, national, or international level, including the G7 and G20, have started to embed industry decarbonization strategies into their agendas. And doing so involves a number of challenges. One is related to the great variety of products, even within narrowly defined sectors. And this means that multiple stakeholders, including on the government side, may need to be involved. Another challenge is the complexity of some industries involving a wide range of processes and cross-border supply chains. But perhaps the biggest challenge to industry decarbonization stems mainly from the high cost and early commercial readiness of many low-carbon technologies. And this creates risk for the private sector actors to invest the amounts required to achieve the decarbonization targets and reach a net zero economy. This is a particularly salient problem for many emerging and developing economies, where the lion's share of the industrial production's increase will likely take place in the coming decades. So this is the context in which at the OECD, we have developed the framework for industry's net zero transition, precisely to develop financing solutions and accelerate industry's net zero transition in emerging and developing economies. So from here on, I will leave it to my colleagues from the CEFIM team who have carried out this important work to present the framework, and I really look forward to collaborating with interested countries. Thank you. So over to you, Dagger, for the presentation.
Thank you very much, Adam. And good morning and good afternoon to everyone. My name is Dagger Saygin, and I'm together today with my two colleagues who also co-authored this framework, Joseph and Cecilia. And thank you to both of them for this great collaboration in the past couple of months that we initiated this new activity under the Clean Energy Finance and Investment Mobilization. So the CEFIM program that is situated at the Environment Directorate of the OECD. This is a new activity which is complementing the already many different activities around renewable power and energy efficiency that we've been undertaking for the past couple of years with already 7 countries, majority of them from Southeast Asia, but also India, Colombia, and our recent country, also Egypt. There are 4 core components to this: preparation of review roadmap reports, so policy recommendations how to accelerate transition in the overall energy sector, implementation support activities, investor dialogues, and regional peer learning. And now we've added a new component to this, and that is the industry decarbonization and this framework, which I will be presenting you today. When it comes to industry, it has been actually sort of forgotten in a way in terms of its importance in terms of the energy use and emissions. The policy on net zero and transition has always been on the power sector, and that has been, of course, a very right choice from a policy perspective. But when we talk about the net zero emission targets, when we look forward to achieving a full decarbonization of the energy system, industry as a major source of CO2 emissions has become very important in the policy debate. It's direct emissions, indirect emissions, and process emissions, so originating from chemical reactions, are accounting now for about 40% of the total global CO2 emissions. So a big source, and the question is, how are we going to decarbonize this? And that decarbonization requires investments and financing. Most importantly, and as we've also heard today at the introduction, the welcome remarks from Alam, the industry growth will be especially going to happen in emerging and developing economies. There had been already this shift in the past couple of decades, but this shift will continue in an accelerated way in the coming decades in many different emerging and developing economies. So this is important, and we need to understand what type of solutions from a technology, but also from a financing and from a policy market perspective to make sure this growth, these new investments are decarbonized, they are low carbon, they are green. And actually many of the international, regional, and national public and private sector-led initiatives, coalitions, industry associations have realized and acknowledged this importance of investing in clean energy technologies in the industry for decarbonization. You may be following already, there are so many decarbonization-related, focusing on specific sectors like steel, cement, or cross-cutting technologies, and what needs to be done in terms of decarbonization. And many actually policy fora at the international level and regional level have also acknowledged this, and there have been different announcements in the past couple of months and years on this topic. When we look at the challenge, and perhaps good to quantify a little bit what we're talking about when it comes to decarbonizing the industry, it's not a very straightforward equation to solve, because lots of different type of low carbon technologies will be needed. So it's not only a question of improving efficiency or increasing the share of renewables for process heat, but there's solutions needed in terms of material efficiency, in terms of capturing carbon, and also using new, cleaner, low carbon fuels like green hydrogen. And the issue here is a majority of the needed technologies are still at early stages of commercialization, and they come with higher costs, and there are also risks related to that. So that's a big problem, especially for a sector which is surviving with profits. It's business oriented. So how are we going to integrate these high cost technologies while maintaining competitiveness in industries? And the investment challenge is equally also present. The investments needed until, and this is only until 2030, but you can imagine also that this trend will need to grow until 2050, is several factor growth needed in clean energy technologies, especially in these capital intensive technologies. And the financing challenge accompanies this investment challenge. And this is the focus area of the framework at the OECD CEFIM team. we have developed on how to overcome this challenge. And if I may just elaborate very briefly, perhaps from an industry perspective, what are the drivers and considerations for a net zero transition in the industry could be. At the very top you see, and this is of course very understandable, okay, there is transition and there is these new technologies, but they mostly come with high cost and they may affect our competitiveness, as I mentioned. So this is probably the main point of consideration by many industries, large or small or medium scale. When it also comes to decarbonization, there are questions around location choices because the raw material, the energy inputs change with different energy mixes in the future. And that also is accompanied with infrastructure needs. Imagine a green hydrogen steel plant, which also requires renewable power, which also requires the infrastructure to bring that hydrogen to the plant. Asset stranding is an important issue in many countries still, which especially those which have younger and newer plants being invested, how to overcome those in the future. Industry supply chains, structure and ownerships are very different, and they are also quite complex in many different country and regional settings. From the perspective of financing, which have been already done with respect to technology transfer, local technology development, R&D, these type of considerations, drivers are important also for industry decarbonization. It can be technical assistance, how are we going to finance it under broader climate finance initiatives, and what would be the implications for carbon markets, ESG development, which is gaining a lot of momentum at the industry, as well as the collaboration across borders. So many variables in such a complex equation, but we want to focus on this complexity, on the need for developing solutions, especially for financing and how to improve the market conditions, because these two solutions could address many of the different considerations and drivers I've just explained you. And the cornerstone of this framework is flexibility. We cannot address everything, but at least with two focus areas of financing and enabling market conditions, depending on the priority of the industries, we should be able to address the transition question in different country settings. When it comes to industry, decarbonization, net zero transition, we've identified three key stakeholders that should be engaged in the implementation or in the context of such framework. Obviously, on the right-hand side, you see the industry actors. So that is the very primary stakeholder. But equally important would be the various different policymakers that are governing the industry strategies, growth, and its decarbonization. And obviously, because we are talking about financing, it's the finance institutions, and they all have their already existing relationships. In the context of this framework, given the richness of the manufacturing industry, we are aiming to select one focus area. In a given country, we cannot address all different industry sectors. Iron, steel, cement, textile, it would be very complex. But we can select one and have a very deep dive, thoroughly understanding how that can be decarbonized. It can also be a cross-cutting technology, let's say motor systems, which can apply to multiple industries. It can be an industry cluster. It can be a selection of SMEs. The characteristics of the industry could also drive the selection of the focus area. Let's say a country could be very much interested in the stranded asset sectors. So this can also be, but the bottom line is to select one focus area. So that's one pillar. The second pillar is to work towards key outcomes. And as I mentioned, it will be the financing and the market solutions, but they should also be accompanying, and you see that on the left-hand side, a pipeline of bankable projects. So towards these outcomes, the idea of this framework is to bring together these three stakeholder groups: industry, finance institutions, and the policymakers. And I want to draw your attention lastly on the slide to the bottom left to the richness of the policymakers, because as I mentioned, industry strategies involves a number of ministries, not only the industry, but also finance, energy planning, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, the framework will also be a way to engage the different policymakers in a country, to engage them and develop these outcomes. And finally, the framework will bring benefits for broader national, international dialogue in relation to energy, climate, and financing policies. The framework consists of 5 steps. So how are we going to implement this framework? We've identified 5 steps. The first step would be just a recap of what I mentioned, to understand who the stakeholders are, engage them, and identify the specific focus area. In parallel to that, and this is in-house work for us, would be to undertake research when it comes to the specific focus area. What are the available technologies? What has been invested recently? What are the policies that are in place, the regulations? What are the financing instruments? So a picture of the as-is current situation. And the outcome of these step 1 and step 2 would lead to the identification of the focus area and a very good understanding of what's happening in that sector. The step 3 is critical because here we would be identifying a net zero pathway and a number of projects to realize that for that focus area. Let's say we selected steel industry. What should the steel industry of country X should look like by, let's say, 2040, 2050 on a net zero pathway, and what type of technologies, low carbon approaches we would need. So a determination of pipeline of projects, and equally important here is their business case. How much it will impact the production costs? What will be their CO2 abatement costs? So to have a quantitative understanding of their business case, because this is essential to identify the market and financing solutions. And subsequently in the step 5, it would be the dissemination of the outcomes. The envisaged framework implementation period is at least a year. It could be, of course, up to several months more, depending on the engagement, depending on the complexity of the industry in that country, but at least 12 months we see that it will be needed to implement. Now, let's have a very quick look at the individual steps to see what we have and how we will be implementing them. As I mentioned in step 1, it is critical because it's an understanding of the actors on ground in the country who would be related to the industry decarbonization, understanding the country priorities for that sector, agreeing on the focus area, and the framework implementation will be, let's say, governed by a steering committee, which will involve several national but also relevant regional actors. And step 1 would lead to, that's the key outcome, I would say, the focus area. In parallel with step 2, to accompany that focus area selection would be an assessment of the current state as is situation, as I mentioned, in terms of regulations, financing, available scenarios for industry decarbonization, and so on and so forth. In step 3, and this was critical because it is looking at the business case. So the idea here is to develop a net zero pathway, and to accompany that net zero pathway, what type of low carbon technologies will be needed and what are their business cases. And when I say the business case, of course, it's the assessment of the costs, but it's also an understanding of the societal and economy-wide impacts, risks, benefits that can be gained from those technologies. So in a short summary, the net zero pathway, which technologies will be needed, so pipeline of projects, and then their assessment of the business case. Step 4 would be the most important from the sense of the outcomes, because in this step, we would be identifying the market enabling solutions and the financing solutions, matching them with the pipeline of technologies we have identified to overcome the existing financing and market barriers. So in creating an enabling market environment condition for these investments to take place, but also identifying how they will be financed. And this is the key outcome, implementable outcome of this framework, the solutions as we call them. And in the step 5, it's a dissemination step to tell the outcomes of this framework at the national level, but also to contribute to what all these different international initiatives that are present, and to contribute to the energy financing and climate policies in the country. So this is a very short summary of the framework. It is now online at the OECD webpage. You can get more information there. Just to summarize here, the CEFIM team here would be coordinating this framework along with the 3 stakeholder groups to arrive at the financing and market solutions and disseminate them for broader policy discussions. The first two countries as part of this work would be Indonesia and Thailand to engage. And we've already, thanks to the both countries, we have had first meetings, and now we are discussing with them on how to engage further in the implementation of this framework in the coming years. At the same time, many new countries are also expressing interest to join from different continents. So we are also very much looking forward to understanding their priorities, and in the very short term also start engaging with them in the implementation of this framework. Thank you very much for your attention, and we are very happy to answer any of your questions after this meeting related to our framework. And now I hand over to my colleague Kumi, our Deputy Director, to start the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Degar, for the very good overview of the OECD framework for industry net zero transition. So as we heard, there's growing number of and also increasing variety of business models to invest in emerging low carbon technologies such as hydrogen or green hydrogen. There's also at the same time rising interest in environmental and social governance or ESG criteria, both in industry and also in the financial sector, as they strive to align their investment decisions and capital allocation decisions with sustainability targets. Degar also highlighted that for each specific national context, how important it is to understand the role of key stakeholder groups in the industry decarbonization, and in particular, policymakers, financing institutions, and industrial companies. So this is very critical to identify what concrete actions that each stakeholder groups can take to create an enabling environment and to design financing solutions for the decarbonization. So let us now move to our panel discussion to address these issues, and also how international cooperation can help to accelerate this progress towards industry decarbonization. So I have the pleasure to introduce this a very nice set of panelists today. We have with us Ibu Andriati Cahyadiningrat. I hope I'm saying your last name right. She is a policy analyst at the Center for Green Industry in the Indonesian Ministry of Industry. Welcome. And we are also joined by, and I hope your microphone and camera are on. And we also have Maud Bornkamp. He's the Acting Deputy Director for Industry Decarbonization, and he's also head of division for Market, Framework, and International Cooperation for the decarbonization of the industry, exactly the topic we are going to discuss today, from the Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action of Germany. We also have Mr. Thomas Guillaume. He's the Chief Executive of Global Cement and Concrete Association. Thank you for joining us. And last but not least, we have Mr. Ajaya Bodhipadian. He is a Senior Operations Officer from International Finance Corporation Asia. So welcome, thanks for joining us. So let me first turn to Ibu Andriati. Let's kick off with an Indonesian perspective. What are the priorities in emerging and developing economies when it comes to industry decarbonization? Over to you.
Ya, selamat siang menjelang sore.
Yes, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Kumi Kitamori, for the time. So, for decarbonization in Indonesia in these industry sectors, we have been doing several actions, and we have started, especially for 8 subsectors, 8 energy subsectors, and in energy sectors, and in general, we also have controlled in reducing emission in certain industries, in other industries, and this is aligned with the implementation of green industry in Indonesia. So for the emission potential, as mentioned in the beginning, that potential arises from the use of energy and the processes, and also other things in the manufacturing process, in the manufacturing process. So for the implementation of the green industry, the controlling and reducing emission focus on energy and process and waste in manufacturers. So in the effort of reducing the emission, of course, it requires modifications of certain technology, and also it requires substitutions of certain technology and substitutions of the material input, which has to be safe for environment and consumer at the same time with low carbon. And these substitutions and modification of technology of the material will be affecting of the volume and the characteristic of the waste, which has potential in improving carbon emission, and those three aspects, those three factors will need financial help. So we propose, according to our journey in implementing the green industry and according to our journey in reducing and managing the emission, strategically, we have certain things, we have certain aspects like controlling or reducing or energy efficiency, and at the same time, the use of the renewable energy, and also by those initiatives in implementing the green industry in the future, we have planned for the CCOS, carbon capture utilization storage, and this still our aspirations in the future. But for right now, we haven't implemented that for the majority of the manufacturing in Indonesia. So the financial needs for decarbonization is based on our journey, and we propose for certain tax free or for income tax or other taxations for product, even for product, as long as it is aligned with the criteria of in our regulation. So for certain industry who have received green certificates, green industry certificates, we propose them to have tax incentives, and also the easiness in the new investment and incentives of the tax of their products. And we encourage for those industry who have received green industry certificates to focus on certain product which we prioritize on green procurement. So this is our effort to create a market for products that came from green industry. So I think that's all from me. That's what we can share with you with regards to our efforts, first in technology, and secondly, in the financial aspect. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ibu Deviati. So very concrete examples from Indonesia. That's very useful. Thank you for sharing, especially very interesting, some of the concrete measures for market creation for green products. So let's turn to maybe more advanced economies. May I invite Malte Bonka from a German federal government to share his perspective. So what can advanced economies do to progress on the global agenda for industrial decarbonization, in particular by proposing standards or definitions for green fuels and green products? Over to you, Malte.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here, and thank you for the excellent presentation. Can you hear me? Because I just got a signal that I'm muted. Okay. So thanks again for having me here, and let me start by emphasizing the urgency of our discussion. The 2020s are the time where decisive years where in industrialized countries, many installations will have to be replaced. So this is really the next years we need the new investments and new technologies. Otherwise, we cannot keep 1.5 degrees within reach. And of course, these investments investments need to be aligned with the climate targets, because otherwise, as has been highlighted before, we will have stranded assets. And at the same time, which has been emphasized, we see growing demand for basic industry materials in emerging and developing countries. And new facilities that are planned and built today, they will operate far beyond 2050. So we need a fundamental transformation of production processes based on decarbonization, electrification, sector coupling, and circularity. So like a technology open approach. And foremost, we need enabling conditions so we have to create an economic and political environment that incentivizes investments in green near zero carbon production facilities, especially in the hard to abate sectors. And for this very reason, Germany made industry decarbonization one of our key points in our G7 presidency. So to kind of coordinate an approach, as you have asked, of more developed states in this regards. Our intention is to set the basis on which markets for green industrial products can flourish. And for this reason, on the one hand, we need agreements on definitions and standards, because this is the first step for all other instruments that may follow. As you probably know, we commissioned an IEA, the International Energy Agency, with a report on achieving net zero heavy industry sectors in G7 members. And I just encourage to have a look into this study, which is was very helpful for our discussion. And one of the key points is, in our view, is a quite elegant proposal for defining near zero and low emission production of steel and cement. And informed by this IEA report, we used the G7 format of the industrial decarbonization agenda within the G7 to advance technical work on standards, definitions, and also assembled a policy toolbox of different policies that can be taken by states. So, of course, one would be carbon pricing, as in the European Union, but we have just heard tax incentives and also green procurement. So there's a wide variety of approaches to be taken. Also, this industry was central in our proposal for a climate club, because you also asked the climate club as an open and cooperative alliance of states that should also give impetus to this development. Of course, with standards and definitions, it's not we will not achieve automatically decarbonization, but we need instruments. And one key aspect here, of course, is to develop finance mechanisms that support the deployment of near zero emission industrial technologies and also associated infrastructure, like for transport and storage, CO2, low emission hydrogen, and electricity production, and improved end-of-life material collection, sorting, and recycling for the circular economy. So we are therefore following the CEFIM's framework for industry net zero transition with great interest, and the work you propose really has a potential to fill a gap in the landscape and further advance the uptake of industry decarbonization. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that information, and particularly given the Germany's G7 presidency at the moment this year. So these are very encouraging things to hear in terms of how the advanced economies are spearheading on this agenda. But of course, we cannot do this without good cooperation with the industry. So we are very happy to have Thomas to join us now to share cement and the concrete association perspective. So from your perspective, what are the factors that are really crucial to make investment decision in low carbon technology?
Well, hello, good morning. I mean, maybe first, let me introduce a little bit the GCCA on what we do. So we stand for the Global Cement and Concrete Association. We have actually covering 80% of the cement capacity, if you want, worldwide outside China. And our members have committed in 2021 to the global roadmap. And I think it's one of the largest commitments from a sector. 80% of the industry outside China, but also some key Chinese manufacturers a representative being there. And you can see on that website the deep convincing of our CEOs, of the CEOs of our members, saying we want to get there. So we have developed actually a roadmap which basically embed all what has been said. I mean, on circularity, on innovation on product, on innovation on technologies, in particular the carbon capture, use on store technology. And the key question for us is how do we bring this global commitment to local action, right? So cement on concrete is a local industry, and things happens. You know, I mean, we all watch these football games, and in football they always say things happens on the pitch, right? And it's a little bit the same for us. I mean, we can have a global commitment, but things happen on the pitch in the country. So what do we do there? So we have launched a program called Net Zero Accelerator, which consists basically of identifying in every country. We partner with the local cement association and with our local members, and we look at how this global roadmap can be implemented locally. And we have to understand what numbers for each decarbonization level, what technologies, what is possible in the country, to understand what are the specifics of the regulation, and to start listing the projects. The projects are very important. This was raised by our German colleague. Indeed, we need to have projects to push this technology beyond and go forward. Now, what you asked me the question, what are the factors that affect? I mean, I think the first comment is this: is we need more demonstration projects on many of these technologies. So it's very important to make this low carbon economy an investable proposition per se. How do we accelerate this development? In fact, we need to act and to make sure that we don't have a first mover disadvantage. You know, you have in the MBA, you learn this concept of first mover advantage when you move into, here we have a first mover disadvantage, right? Because in fact, this is costly, and you come into a market that do not today recognize and do not give any green premium for the low carbon system. So what are these possibilities? I mean, first, I mean, we have demand signals, right? Demand signals, which basically are commitment from end user, buyers, be it public or private. On that note, I mean, 60% in some countries, up to 60% of the demand comes from public prescriptions, be it through norms, through works, through public infrastructure development, etc. So it's very important that provide a vision on visibility on future low carbon product offtake. So, I mean, yes, we will do infrastructure, but we want that projects to be done with low carbon cement, low carbon material, low carbon concrete. In that work, the work done by international organizations like the First Mover Coalition, like IDDI, like LEAD, I mean, this is essential to actually obtain and define the rule of the games for this type of things. I think the second thing is certainly the policy framework. You have this very nice triptych, this trio where you said industry, policymaker, on finance people. I think this is absolutely spot on. And one of them is indeed policy. So we need to reinforce sorry, I put myself on mute and so I was saying we need to have and to make sure that a low carbon economy, a differentiated low carbon economy emerge on our public market, on our economy. And this is important again for the first mover. You need to have basically to enable that a policy framework stable. We need to ensure that there is a level playing field, right? And this is understanding by also limiting the risk of carbon leakage. So typically a regulation on carbon pricing, yes, but you know we need to use systematically the forwards carbon pricing on carbon leakage mechanism, because you don't want again to be the first one to invest and then to be pushed back by other non-decarbonized company. So carbon price works, but with border adjustment mechanism. We need to have typically mechanism like carbon system for carbon contract for difference. You know, a little bit like it was done in Europe to push the wind energy back in the early 2000. We had a fixed price for the kilowatt hour in this. And there, I mean, if you take carbon, you have different ways of doing that. I mean, we have in Europe, we have been developing the emission trading schemes, which is basically putting a cost on carbon. And you have also the American, I mean, lately they have actually developed a positive price to carbon. So the Department of Energy in US is paying your project up to $85 per ton of carbon. So it's a positive payment to make sure that the project can go on and can have profitability. And very few, I finish with that. We have other opportunity like a preferential public procurement, for example, material mandate, quota. So all these things from the public procurement can help actually to create this differentiated market and to make sure that there is the low carbon material is not competing against the high carbonated material, so to say.
Yeah. No, thank you, Thomas. And you know, you really, what you just said, underline one of the points they're gonna make, that how the roadmap and strategy have to be very specific, not only to country context, we talked about that, but also sector, the industry, because, you know, as we see, it's very different than steel, for example, because it's not highly traded, but very important to link to local manufacturers. So I think your association's work is very, very critical there. So thank you for that. And now let us turn to Ajaya, so he can tell us a little bit more about how, you know, enabling environment or policy environment and others could help to unlock capital mobilization, and what are the main barriers for scaling up low carbon technologies in emerging and developing economies from your perspective. Over to you, Ajaya.
Hi, thank you. First of all, at the very outset, I would like to congratulate OECD team for this fantastic framework, which is very comprehensive in nature as well as flexible. And from IFC, we are really glad to be associated with this study, providing multiple inputs at various points in time. Yeah, I mean, definitely this is a very timely discussion in a sense that the industry in general in the emerging markets, especially in Asia, are at the crossroad. The entire instability in the macro environment, on the one side, are putting a lot of competitiveness pressure on the industrial scenario in Asia, while at the same time, these industries are facing mounting challenges from the multiple corners to go green and phase out the fossil fuel or coal to become carbon neutral or more sustainable in nature. Many large corporates have already implemented a lot of low-hanging measures, but many of them are still grappling with the new frontier technologies or the so-called deep decarbonization technologies, which can put them more credibly on the net zero transition pathway. And the challenges as we see today are access to technologies, the access to or rather availability of the bankable projects, the access to finance, the more targeted financial instruments, and last but not the least, the entire policy environment or the enabling environment, which you just talked about. And certainly in the whole discussion, the enabling environment context is very, very important. Now, I would like to divide that comment into two segments. One, in the developing country, we see that there are the low-hanging technologies, the so-called energy efficiency technologies or material recycling, circularity technologies, which has reasonably good amount of the energy savings and GHG savings potential are available, but their penetration are not as abundant as it should be. I mean, there are few countries like India and China where we have seen the greater level of penetration. However, there are many other countries in the region where the penetration is still yet to catch up with. Now, these are the areas where there are need for greater awareness, the availability of the cheaper credits, not just to implement, but also to rapidly scale up and replicate the technologies across the different industry segments. Especially, I should point out that there are large segments of the SMEs who essentially lack the access to the cheaper technologies and the cheaper credits. And many of these SMEs are quite energy intensive. So the need of the hour is to enable the overall environment, the access to credits and access to technology, and low cost access to technologies to help the SMEs to transition to a more low carbon or net zero pathway. And this is where, more importantly, to also support the ESCOs, the energy service companies, or the RESCOs, who play a big role in terms of taking the risk of the upfront investment, and also to enable the savings on the ground through multiple different business models. So the important aspect would be to create an environment where their business model can thrive, and these ESCOs or RESCOs get the access to the cheaper credit so as to make the changes happen on the ground. The most difficult part are to deal with the deeper decarbonization technologies, because as we see that many of these technologies are highly capital intensive, there are lack of the reference plant and the data. Most companies are trying to finance those through off-balance sheet mechanism. And certainly there are no ready-made market to support their feasibility. There are also the considerable level of the price variability in the market. Now, this is where comes a greater importance of mobilizing concessional finance at a scale, or so to say the blended finance at a scale, in order to support the piloting and the implementation of some of the technologies. But the developing countries not only should look at the concessional finance, which are mostly available as a catalytic finance, but also should look at the large scale, the grant support for R&D and the piloting of some of these technologies. Because even the R&D or the piloting of some of these technologies are quite risky and expensive compared to many other technologies which have achieved that scale. From the financial institutions perspective, we see that a lot of these discussions happening on the concessional finance, and the demand for concessional finance is also growing among the industries in the developing countries. But this is where we particularly think there are scope for the follow-on research. I mean, something maybe as a follow-on to this framework which you have presented, that what does concessionality mean in the specific country context and the sector context and technology context. So a certain technology in a country A at a given point of time may need the concessional finance, but at a different time scale, it may not need the concessional finance because it has already achieved the maturity. So that level of those nuances needs to be worked out in a more comprehensive framework to map the technologies and the geographies at a different time scale to arrive at certain framework of concessionality, so that from the point of view of the donors or the mobilizer of capital, it becomes easier to allocate concessional finance at a scale to support some of the technologies. In terms of policy reforms, I will also particularly mention about the World Bank Group's initiatives on the Country and Climate Development Report, which we call the CCDR for individual countries. And this is the work ongoing, covering quite a few Asian countries. So the recent one has been published for Vietnam. CCDR supports government to achieve the development goals in the context of mitigation and adaptation to climate change and identify opportunities for climate actions. And these particular studies are enlisting a series of the policy reform initiatives which the government can implement to unlock the investment opportunities in future. Last but not the least, such financing discussion also needs to be made more inclusive, considering the aspect of the just transition. We are talking about the net zero transition, but we know very well that as we move into net zero, there will be winners and losers. even within the industry, there are certain category of industry who will lose out as we move into the net zero scale. So it's important that sufficient economic and the financial safeguards to be embedded within the economic decision in order to protect those vulnerable segments of the industries as well as the society. So thank you. That's my initial remarks against your question.
Thank you very much. Very interesting perspective from financing institutions, especially with this concrete examples on some of the discussion happening. And I thought it was very interesting. You distinguished between some of the easier technologies, low-hanging fruit that you mentioned, and that are very different considerations for financing access to credit compared to more deep technologies that are still under development that's needed for deep decarbonization. And then what you said about the concessionality, just to complement what the IFC and the World Bank Group as a family are doing. So at the OECD, we are now developing a blended finance guidance for clean energy transition. So this will be an interesting addition to this conversation that's happening that you mentioned. So thank you so much for that. And maybe we can, I think we still have time. Maybe I can come back to Indonesia, Ibu Andriati. If I may, maybe I can pose you a second question regarding, a developing country perspective. So what is, in your opinion, is the role of international cooperation to support the industry net transition to zero, the net zero transition, and especially in the context of mobilizing finance at global scale? Over to you.
Ya, jadi berdasarkan memang seperti tadi yang sudah disampaikan.
According to what is presented and delivered by other panelists, that it is true that the needs of financing, especially for transitions, technological modifications, and other things, and so on and so forth, international institutions will play big role in providing supports, especially the easiness for certain industry in developing country to do energy technological transitions. Aside of transition, there's one thing. There's one other thing. The capacity of the human resources should be also taken into account. So therefore, for international institutions, they should also provide some kind of trainings or capacity buildings for human resources in certain industry, because when we are transitioning technology or developing the technology or modifying technology, so we have to equip the human resources with certain skill sets. So with regards to that, with regards to the financial institutions, of course, this it is required to have the easiness of access for developing country to respond on financial support in transitioning the technology and human resources. Thank you. That's from me.
Thank you very much. And maybe I can turn to Malta now from Germany's perspective. And again, same, the role of international cooperation, we talked already about it a little bit, but especially in the context of, scaling up finance mobilization at the global scale from Germany or G7 perspective, please.
Thank you. Yes, I think the most important progress we have to make is that some states go ahead jointly in this stage also and implement markets for green products. And with these markets, also the technologies will become scale up and cheaper. And then we need cooperation methods with emerging economies and also developing countries. So the central challenge is to scale up the markets for the green technologies. And I'd also like to comment on what Thomas Guyot has said on carbon leakage. Of course, since this is an industry, industry is always in international competition, and of course there is the issue of carbon leakage. We look at this, of course, as the industry department very closely. On the other hand, you have to see, like, an overall picture. It's a transitional problem. If we manage, if we succeed, like once we have decarbonized industries, then there will not be higher climate costs for those sectors. But of course, this is a long way, and so in the short, medium term, there may be advantages for those which do less than others. But I'd just like to emphasize, apart from like measures to be taken as this carbon border adjustment has been mentioned, I think it's also important to really cooperate and to join forces here to create new markets, and then establish these markets on a global scale. So this is also what we actually also aim at with the idea of the Climate Club as a cooperative alliance. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Marty, for that. And okay, so maybe it's timely to come back to industry representative Thomas in this context. So you earlier talked about international competitiveness concern, and we just also heard from Marty on that. But that was more general. If we turn to specific needs for private sector in emerging and developing economies, I understand your association also represents global membership. So what are their needs specifically more for developing and emerging economies in the context of decarbonization?
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I agree. So fundamentally, the first thing that we need, I would start by the basic. I mean, we need to have our homework done. The first thing is everywhere in the world we need to have this activation roadmap. So what are the projects? What are the discussion on legal level? What do we want to achieve? And this discussion needs to take place in cooperation with the government in a trustful manner. Say, listen, these are the elements. You said it, circularity, for example. Circularity implies a lot of adjustment on the legislation on landfill ban, for example, or limiting or putting a fee on landfill to make sure that there is enough space to do business on circularity. It will always be cheaper to put the waste in a pot than to transport it, transform it, and reuse it into any other industry. So I think my first message would be the first thing we need is cooperation. Cooperation across the industry, cooperation among the industry to develop technologies, to make sure that we quickly access the technologies. In that sense, we have opened some acceleration platform, for example, where technologies are actually brought forward to the industry in a very non-financial way. So I mean, we don't ask anything. We just want the technologies to be accelerated. So they are made available for the industry to decarbonize, and across the value chain as well. I mean, very interesting number in cement. I mean, on concrete, if you consider the decarbonization of cement, the cost of that is probably an increase between 60 to 70% of the material itself, which is huge for the industry. But if you look at the cost in the final product, the flat you build, you own, the housing, the infrastructure, this cost translated into the total price of the infrastructure is only 3% of cost increase, which is, in this case, relatively moderate. And we need to cooperate across the value chain to make sure that this actually is developed. Cooperation also, we said, with financing institution, and they are like very much what the IFC said. Yes, we need to put in place some de-risking or risk sharing mechanism, and this is about the support to accelerate and to make sure that the capital, whatever form it is, flows into the industry. So again, the idea is really to suppress the first mover advantage or to de-risk the first mover disadvantage. We need to develop taxonomy, favorable taxonomy that explain on put threshold. We need to have this public funding the grants is one element. Yes, the low interest rate, the concession loan. These are all elements that are important and that can be discussed in a trustful manner. I mean, in a program typically like the one you are putting. My last point would be also something that Malte mentioned a little bit. We need to have common definition. We need to make sure that low carbon cement or low carbon concrete is well understood and that there is no greenwashing in all that. That the technologies and the solution we are bringing are clear. That the standards are also clear to enable so that there is no cheating and that the route is clear and that there is comparable on level playing field. So for me, these are all elements that needs to be discussed. And here we are a little bit at a crossroad where, yes, for a transition time for the next 30 years, we need to put in place the structure, the mechanism to discuss that and to make sure that all these activities are accelerated, are taking ground. And I really welcome the discussion you have opened here because we have actually in our accelerator program, Thailand, Indonesia, we are a lot of members in Indonesia, and therefore we can start to build that for cement on concrete and to start to have that discussion in a very meaningful way and in a very trustful way to build and to go towards a net zero transition in these countries. And I'm very much looking forward to that in the future.
Thank you so much. Maybe if I may just come back to you, Thomas. I thought it was really, very interesting fact, and I think I heard it before, and then what you just said reminded me about the importance of collaboration across the value chain and how, for the cement or steel input manufacturer at that level, the cost increase for going green might be big at 60–70%, but when it goes to the final product, actually the marginal increase is very little, 2–3%. So it may be manageable, but how would that work? I mean, what are the concrete ways in which this cost sharing or spreading across the value chain? How is it being done in concrete terms? Can you give us an example?
Yeah, again, I'm back to the segregation of demand, or earlier I was saying differentiated demand. That's the demand signals, right? So if the government says, okay, this piece of infrastructure will be built only with low carbon cement, low or net zero carbon cement, then you have space to have an investment and you create a demand where all the value chain will adapt to that. If you do not have this obligation, I come with my 70% more expensive material, but I will be undercut because I'm not selling the infrastructure myself. Somebody else is selling the infrastructure, right? So when in an open bid, in an open tender, if you don't specify this, I mean, if you look only at cost, I mean, I will never win the tender on my product, will never go to the market, right? So we need to put in place and to consider really this whole system so that the final specifier of this whole value chain asks for this low carbon material or net zero material, depending of the time, depending of the context. And that's why it's so important to actually consider that at the holistic level. Yes, we are not use that. I mean, we are in liberal spirit, liberal economy, but we need to have at this stage of transition a little bit of direction on strategy, on vision, on how this can happen, on making sure that the things is flowing in a fluid way. Maybe just an additional point, as you give me back the word, sorry if I'm a bit long. This is also valid across industry and also valid for the choice of the technologies that are being pushed. I mean, there was an interesting report from the World Economic Forum done with Accenture that was showing the cost of removing carbon for economy per industry. And cement happened to be one of the cheapest industry to decarbonize. So it's expensive for cement industry itself, but it is cheap for the society. The break-even cost to remove carbon in cement was $85, whereas it is above 200 on well above 200 in steel, in aluminium, in ammonia, etc., etc. And this is because of the cost of hydrogen in large. That's the justification. But I think it's important that we have all these elements in the mind at the time to decide where we go and at the time to select, the pathway. So we need to build the pathway together and get these things forward. No,
thank you for that. And again, that goes back to what Marta said earlier about the importance of definitions and standards, what's meant by green steel, cement, and minimum content requirement or the share of inputs in terms of circularity, etc. So thank you for closing the loop. And maybe I will go to Ajaya for maybe the final comment coming from a financing institution's perspective. So you earlier talked about, and also earlier speaker talked about the financing models and business models. But from your perspective, what are the kind of new and emerging or new models for financing that we might want to pay attention to for industry decarbonization?
Okay, hi. So you see that since 2012 or 13, the overall green loan market is accelerating, and today we are seeing that since 2013 there is a 41% growth of the green loan and the green bond market. So in terms of financing instruments, the green bond has matured, though green bond is still targeting not a very diverse set of asset classes, but mostly focusing on the renewables. Now, of late, what we are seeing that the few instruments which are emerging, and the primary of it is the transition bond or the transition loan, and which gives flexibility to the private sector organizations, particularly to access this loan against certain low carbon targets. Similarly, there is also emergence of sustainability linked financing, where the targets or KPIs are just not around the climate change or carbon mitigations, but they have a flexibility to choose certain other sustainability target and use this as access this as a corporate finance and use for various other sustainability initiatives. Now, the challenge, however, is that if you think of the developing country context, many of these new instruments are fairly new and less matured to target the hard-to-abate sector, the reality of the hard-to-abate sector. And when we see the hard-to-abate sector, typically the steel, cement, chemicals, and few others, now for several years, especially for the emerging economies, these segments were shut out of the green finance market, primarily because the inherent nature of the business and the inherent nature of their operations is high carbon intensive. The financing in the name of climate finance, which was actually going to these hard-to-abate sectors, were actually financing the so-called established technologies like energy efficiency or resource efficiency and so on and so forth. But hardly those were targeting the high-risk, high-impact, the innovative decarbonization solutions. And as Thomas has also pointed out, that going forward, there would be need for more de-risking instruments, providing the credit guarantee facilities from the government, also from the multilateral institutions. And of course, the overall concessionality, the concessional finance that needs to be accelerated. Now, in terms of transition loan or transition finance, there are two big challenges, especially for this type of instruments to gain pace in the developing country context. One, transition finance often works with the assumption that the organization or the borrowers should have a credible transition pathway. Now, in the context of developing economies, this is still a very big problem, a very big challenge. There are often the shifting narratives even within the organization that how this transition pathway will look like, and what would be the kind of MRV, the monitoring, reporting, the verification protocol to measure that this transition pathway is actually happening, leading to net zero or low carbon. So that is number one. Number two, even on the part of the instruments by itself, there are lack of standards. So today we see that the green bond is sort of being regulated by the ICMA and few other standards. But when you talk about sustainability linked financing or transition linked financing, these are the least standardized or certified instruments at this point of time. So a lot of work needs to be done by the expert organization, by international organization to come forward, collaborate, and create appropriate standards and build capacity both for the borrowers as well as for the lenders. Because mind that in the financial institutions in the developing economies, very few in the banks do really understand the dynamics or the nitty-gritties of financing green projects vis-a-vis non-green projects. So there are substantial capacity needs to be built. And just to mention that central banks in few of the countries, they have already started taking initiatives, but I would say those are the very nascent, the preliminary or initial stage, and significant work needs to be done to educate the overall banking system so that some of these instruments really gain the popularity and achieve its effectiveness, so to say, to achieve the low carbon transition. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And well, I think we are almost approaching the end of our webinar. So let me try to just sum up some of the key points that came out. And again, many thanks to all the panelists and the presenters from OECD Secretariat and all the stakeholders that joined today and the audience. But maybe I can just attempt to sum up in a few words. So I think some of the key things here is that the decarbonization is key, but there's a lot of pressure on competitiveness around product cost increase. And so there's a silent risk for first movers, advantage or disadvantage, as it was mentioned. Also, decarbonization needs to be understood at both the country-specific context, but also sector-specific, industry-specific context. And then because of this, the flexibility of the framework that we just presented today is very important in selecting which focus area and what would fit in for a given country. Also, while technology neutral approach is needed for decarbonization effort, we also need to have support that with demonstration projects and projects that can lead to bankable projects. So this needs to be happening at the global level in order to support technology transfer and technical assistance that was also mentioned by our Indonesian colleague. These should be accompanied with technical standards and common definitions, and also policy toolbox and ways to improve the enabling conditions that many of us talked about today. There's also a need to create market through particularly public procurement and address potential carbon leakage. That's very important. Addressing suitable and concessional credit and loans, innovative financing instruments for all low carbon technologies, including both large enterprises and SMEs, are needed, complemented with innovative business models to accompany that. Some low-hanging fruits exist, and some technologies with proven business models are difficult to scale up because of a difficulty in access to finance, especially for SMEs in emerging economies, and that needs to be kept in mind. In parallel, de-risking and risk-sharing mechanisms will be needed, especially for the deep decarbonization of hard-to-abate sectors that was emphasized by some of the speakers. And we need to address the aspects of not only the net zero transition, but also the just transition that was mentioned, because in any transitions, there are some losers and winners and losers, and we need to be very mindful of this kind of distributional implications. And in that respect, capacity building is key. And already working with Indonesia, we are already working with Indonesia on this through this program of the OECD that we mentioned, to support skills development and to expand on this for industry decarbonization as well. So thank you so much again for the rich discussion for the last hour and a bit. And from the OECD side, we are very much looking forward to continuing our cooperation with the countries, governments, but also industries and financial institutions and all the other stakeholders present going forward. So thank you very much. And then please stay tuned for further activities and announcements from the OECD on this topic, and they will be available publicly on our website. So thank you again and see you soon next time. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
Bye.
you.